There's a couple in their late 70s who live about 40 minutes outside of Raleigh. They've been married 53 years. Their daughter told a researcher something strange during an interview. She said watching her parents interact was sometimes uncomfortable because they still seemed to be paying attention to each other. Not in a showy way, just in the way that made her realize she and her own husband had stopped doing it somewhere along the line without either of them noticing. That's the thing that gets me about the research on long, happy marriages. It's not the grand gestures. It's not the romantic vacations or the counseling sessions or the anniversary dinners. It's the paying attention. And the reason it looks strange to younger people is that most couples, somewhere in their 40s or 50s, quietly stop doing it. Not out of cruelty, not because the love dried up, just because life is loud, and there's a pharmacy to get to, and someone needs to call the insurance company, and by the time you're sitting across from your person at dinner, you're both so hollowed out, you're basically two people sharing a table by coincidence. The couples who stayed happy, genuinely happy, not just together, figured something out that most relationship advice completely misses. And it's not a technique. It's more like a stance toward each other that they either found naturally or fought their way to. Either way, they held on to it. And the couples who quietly fell into a kind of polite roommate arrangement did the same thing they always did, mostly, just with less of the thing that actually mattered underneath. So let's talk about what they actually did. The quiet stuff. The things you wouldn't see in a highlight reel. The first thing you notice when you study couples who made it to 50 years and still like each other is that they have what researchers call a high positive to negative ratio in how they talk about their relationship's history. But forget the jargon. What it actually means is this. When you ask them about their marriage, they tend to lead with the good parts. Not because their marriage was perfect. Some of them had brutal years, real losses, infidelities even. But because their default frame, their instinct, is to see the whole thing as something worth having. You ask them how they met, and their eyes move in a different direction than a couple who's just enduring. John Gottman spent 40 years studying couples in his lab at the University of Washington. And one of the things his research kept surfacing was the power of what he called the story of us. Happy long-term couples have one. They have a narrative about their relationship that gives it meaning, and they update that narrative as they go. Struggling couples have one too, but it tends to be a story of disappointment, of what was promised and not delivered, of who they used to be and what went wrong. The story shapes everything. It shapes how you hear your partner's tone of voice. It shapes whether you assume good intent when they forget something or assume carelessness. It shapes whether an argument is something you're having or something you're in. Here's why that matters so much after 50. By the time you're in your 50s and 60s, you have a long story. You have decades of material. And if the story you're telling yourself is mostly a ledger of grievances and missed connections, it colors everything going forward. Every new small moment gets filed into that old folder. Every sigh lands a certain way. The couples who stayed happy, and this is the part that takes some honesty to sit with, made decisions, sometimes very deliberate decisions, about the story they were telling. Not lying to themselves, not pretending bad years didn't happen, but choosing, consciously, to let the fuller picture be the dominant one. That's actually something you can do, right now. Not in a greeting card way. Just, what's the story you're telling about your marriage or your long partnership? Is it generous? Is it fair to both of you? Because the story you're carrying is doing work on your present whether you know it or not. The second thing the research keeps finding is something that sounds almost too small to matter until you realize you haven't done it in years. Turning toward. Gottman's team watched couples interact, and they tracked what they called bids for connection. A bid is any small reaching out, a comment about something on the news, A laugh about the dog doing something ridiculous, a hand on a shoulder, a question about how the day went. And they found that happy couples didn't necessarily make more bids. What they did was respond to them. They turned toward instead of away. They looked up from the phone. They laughed at the joke. They said, "What happened?" instead of giving a non-committal sound. Sounds small, but Gottman's research found that couples who eventually divorced had what he called a turning toward rate of about 33%. Couples who stayed together and were happy had a rate closer to 87%. That's not a small gap. That's a completely different relationship happening in the same house. The reason this gets harder as you get older isn't that you love each other less. It's that you have more competing demands on your attention, more accumulated fatigue, more things pulling you in different directions. And frankly, after decades together, you start to assume you already know what the other person is going to say. That assumption is one of the quiet killers. Because people change. People keep changing into their 60s and 70s, keep having new thoughts and new worries and new enthusiasms. And the partner who was still genuinely curious about the person sitting across from them, that's who the research kept pointing to as the one in the happy couple. So a practical thing, if you want one. The next time your partner says something, anything, something minor, try the actual full response instead of the half one. Look up. Ask the follow-up question. Not because you're following a method, just to see what happens. 9 times out of 10, it opens something. Now here's where it gets interesting. A lot of relationship advice, especially the kind aimed at older couples, focuses on communication, learning to express feelings, avoiding criticism, using I statements, all of that. And those things aren't useless. But the couples in the research who were genuinely thriving at 50 years didn't necessarily have perfect communication styles. Some of them bickered. Some of them interrupted each other. Some of them had very different ways of processing conflict. What they had instead was something more fundamental. They gave each other the benefit of the doubt. Researchers call it positive sentiment override. It means that when your baseline feelings about your partner are warm and good, you interpret their ambiguous behavior charitably. Your partner snaps at you, you think they're stressed, not that they resent you. Your partner forgets something important, you think they're overwhelmed, not that they don't care. Versus negative sentiment override, where the baseline has gone sour, and even neutral behavior starts to read as hostile. The couples who stayed happy had, by and large, maintained positive sentiment override. And this is the thing. It's not naive. It's not ignoring real problems. It's more like a muscle that you either keep using or let atrophy. And at a certain point, if you've let it go long enough, negative sentiment override can become almost invisible to you. Just the water you're swimming in. And every small thing your partner does confirms the story of distance you're already telling. The antidote isn't forced positivity. The antidote is what the happy couples were actually doing, which was continuing to invest in the friendship. Not the romantic partnership, not the co-parenting structure, not the household management system. The friendship. They kept doing things together that had nothing to do with logistics. They kept talking about things that weren't bills or grandchildren or doctor appointments. They kept being interested in each other as people. Which brings up the part of this that I think gets skipped most often, especially for people in their 50s and 60s. The role of admiration. There's something researchers call the fondness and admiration system in a relationship, and it's basically how much you still see things to respect and like in your partner. Not just love, like. The people in long, happy marriages were still noticing things to admire, still saying so, sometimes out loud, sometimes just registering it internally, still feeling what one researcher described as glad this specific person is in my life, rather than glad I am not alone. That distinction sounds subtle, but it's not. One is a relationship, the other is an arrangement. And here's the hard part of this, which good research is honest enough to surface. Admiration doesn't just survive on its own. It needs input. It needs new information about your partner. It needs your partner to keep growing and you to keep noticing. And this is where a lot of couples hit a wall around the 50s and 60s. Because this is also when the kids leave, when careers wind down or end, when health starts requiring more management, when the shape of daily life changes dramatically. A lot of couples, without meaning to, stop growing in ways that are visible to each other. They stop introducing new material, and admiration quietly starves. The couples who stayed happy in the research had, almost universally, kept some form of personal development going. Not always dramatic, not always career-related, but something. A skill they were learning, a project, a passion that was theirs alone and that they brought back to the table, not to perform for their partner, but because people who are still growing have something to show, and people who have something to show keep being interesting to the person who's been watching them for 50 years. This is actually something to think about for yourself, not just your relationship. What are you doing right now that's genuinely new for you? Not new like a different brand of cereal. New like you're learning something, building something, uncomfortable in some small productive way. Because that's not just good for you. It turns out it's good for your partnership in a way that's hard to replicate otherwise. There's another thing the research consistently finds in happy older couples, and it surprised me when I first read it. They fight. Not all the time, not cruelly, but they do. What they don't do is stonewall. Stonewalling, withdrawing, going silent, physically leaving the conversation and emotionally shutting down, is one of what Gottman identified as the 4 horsemen of relationship breakdown. The others are criticism, contempt, and defensiveness. And out of those 4, contempt is the most dangerous. Contempt is the eye roll, the dismissive laugh, the you always and you never, the treating of your partner like someone beneath your patience. Contempt is what happens when you've let enough resentment build that it starts to leak out sideways, and it's corrosive in a way that regular conflict simply isn't. The couples who stayed happy didn't avoid conflict, but they fought without contempt, mostly. And when contempt showed up, because it does in any long marriage, the ones who made it were the ones who recognized it and walked it back. Not because they were better people necessarily, but because they developed enough shared vocabulary and enough history of repair that they could say, essentially, I went too far there, and mean it, and have it received. Repair. That's the word that comes up over and over in this research. The ability to repair after conflict, after a bad week, after a period of distance. Repair doesn't mean pretending it didn't happen. It means making a move toward the other person that says, whatever that was, I don't want it to be the last word between us. And the happy couples had better repair mechanisms. Some of them had jokes or phrases that served as a kind of signal. I'm being an idiot. Let's start over. Some of them had learned to give each other time and then come back. Some of them simply knew which one of them was better at making the first move after a fight, and accepted that without keeping score. Not keeping score, by the way, is a bigger thing than it sounds. The couples in distress often had what researchers call an accounting mentality. Who did more? Who gave more? Who was wronged more often? The happy couples had not an absence of fairness, but a longer view of it. They weren't checking the books after every interaction. They trusted that over time, over the long arc of the partnership, things balanced out in ways that individual moments couldn't show. And they were right. They just had to keep trusting that long enough to find out. Here's something else about long, happy marriages that surprised me: the role of independence. Not distance, not disconnection, but actual separate lives, separate friendships, separate interests, maintained deliberately. The couples who were happiest at 50 years weren't joined at the hip. In fact, many of them had learned over the decades to give each other real room, real space, not as a punishment, not as a symptom of drifting, as a sign of respect. There's a kind of suffocating togetherness that can develop, especially in retirement, when two people suddenly find themselves spending 24 hours a day together for the first time in 30 years and discover they have no idea how to do it. One of the things therapists who work with older couples hear constantly is, "We're together all the time and somehow lonelier than ever." And that's not a paradox if you understand what makes intimacy work. It requires some distinctness. Two people have to remain somewhat separate, somewhat their own selves, to have anything to bring to each other. The happy couples kept their friendships, kept activities that belonged only to them. Some kept a standing dinner with old friends. Some had a hobby the other one wasn't part of. Some took separate trips occasionally. And when they came back to each other from those separate spaces, they came back with something to say, something to share. The relationship kept being fed by material from outside of it. That might sound like the opposite of commitment, but it's actually what sustains it. People don't stay in love with a version of themselves that stopped at the age they got married. They stay in love with a person who kept becoming. And you can only keep becoming if you have room to do it. Now, let me say something that doesn't come up in most of these conversations. The couples who made it 50 years and were still genuinely glad about it, many of them had at least one significant crisis in the marriage. Not all of them, but many. A period of real distance, or a betrayal, or a loss so heavy it reshaped everything, or a crossroads where one of them seriously considered leaving. And they made it through not because the crisis wasn't real, but because they chose, at the hardest moment, to stay in it long enough to find out what came next. The ones who tell you marriage is easy after 50 years are either very lucky or not being fully honest with you. The ones who look you in the eye and say, "It was hard for a while and then it wasn't," those are the ones whose marriages mean something, because they chose it when it wasn't automatic. They chose it when it would have been easier to stop. And that choice, that conscious decision to work on something, rather than exit it, became part of their story about the relationship. It became evidence that the thing was worth choosing, and that evidence held them together through smaller difficulties for decades after. There's a phrase that keeps coming up in interviews with couples who've been together 40, 50, 60 years and are still happy. And it's not romantic in the way you'd expect. It's something more like, "We figured out we were on the same side." Not that they agreed on everything, not that they'd become the same person, but that they stopped experiencing the relationship as adversarial. They stopped treating every disagreement as a referendum on the marriage. They started treating problems as something that happened to both of them together, instead of as attacks from one person on the other. That shift, from us against each other to us against the problem, sounds like a cliché until you've lived in a marriage long enough to feel the difference in your body between those two stances. One of them is exhausting. One of them is actually sustainable. And the couples in the research who were still laughing together at 70, still reaching for each other's hands, still wanting to know what the other person thought about something, they'd found that stance and held it. You don't get to 50 years of happy marriage by accident, but you also don't get there by following a 10-step program. You get there by a series of small decisions, made mostly without fanfare, to keep showing up as someone who still thinks this person is worth paying attention to keep turning toward, to keep updating the story you're telling in the direction of generosity, to keep being someone interesting enough, someone still growing enough, that your partner has a reason to keep paying attention to you, too. The couples who got there, the ones sitting in their 70s with the thing that made that daughter in Raleigh vaguely uncomfortable because it looked so unfamiliar, They didn't have a secret. They just kept doing the thing that most people quietly stopped doing, somewhere in the noise and fatigue of middle life. They kept being each other's person on purpose. That's worth something. That's worth a lot, actually. And if some part of what you just heard sounded less like information and more like something you already knew, something you've just been too busy or too tired or too resigned to act on, well, now you know that you know it. That's usually where things can start to change.